The mansion on Hollow Ridge Lane had been abandoned for years before Jenna Ortega moved in. Located on the edge of Los Angeles, tucked into the shadows of a dense, overgrown forest, the house seemed to almost dare you to approach. The locals whispered about it stories of strange sounds, flickering lights, and the occasional glimpse of a shadow moving behind one of the many fogged windows. But Jenna, a rising star in Hollywood, wasn't one to be deterred by superstitions. The price was right, and she was drawn to the house's vintage elegance, the intricate moldings, the grand staircase, and the promise of space for her creativity. The first night was peaceful. The floorboards creaked underfoot as Jenna explored the cavernous rooms, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Everything looked well-kept despite its age, yet something about the air felt off. But after all, it was just an old house, nothing more. By the third night, though, something changed. She woke to a faint sound, a tapping, almost imperceptible, coming from the hallway. She lay still, listening, the shadows of the room stretching unnaturally in the moonlight. Her heart raced as the tapping grew louder, now unmistakable, as if someone was walking just outside her door, their steps deliberate but slow. Jenna held her breath, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The door was ajar, and she could see a sliver of darkness beyond the threshold. Her eyes darted to the hallway, empty but oppressive. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse. The house was holding its breath, waiting. The next morning, she decided to explore the hallway. As she moved through the corridor, her footsteps echoed loudly in the stillness. At the far end, one door was slightly open, revealing nothing but an eerie, stagnant air. When she reached it, she couldn't help but notice how cold it was, how the temperature seemed to drop. A sharp chill ran down her spine. The door was locked, but when she turned to leave, she felt it, something behind her. Presence. A soft, almost imperceptible sound of breathing, coming from somewhere in the walls. Jenna whipped around, but there was nothing, just the feeling of being watched, of being followed. It wasn't until the second week that things started to get more intense. She began to notice the shadows at the corners of her eyes, lingering just a little too long before vanishing. In the middle of the night, she'd hear faint whispers, low and unintelligible, coming from the walls. The voices always stopped when she tried to focus on them. One evening, Jenna was unpacking her things in one of the many bedrooms, her back to the window. A sudden gust of wind slammed the shutters shut, making her jump. The room was colder than it should have been. Then, something caught her reflection in the mirror. A figure, just behind her, standing perfectly still. She spun around, but the room was empty. Jenna thought she was losing her mind. She'd searched every inch of the house, every room, every closet, every basement, but found no answers. The longer she stayed, the worse it got. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and she could hear them clearly now, her name. Jenna. It was always followed by a door creaking open, or a faint footstep behind her, so close that she could feel the pressure on her skin. But no one was there. One morning, she found a door she'd never seen before. Hidden behind an old tapestry in a forgotten corner of the mansion. It was small and old, and yet it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. She turned the knob. The room beyond was not what she expected. It wasn't a forgotten attic or closet, but a study, dark and cold, with shelves full of dusty books and papers. As Jenna moved deeper into the room, her eyes landed on a journal, its pages yellowed, its leather cover cracked. She opened it, flipping through the entries until one line stopped her cold. It was written in a sharp, hurried script. They never left. They're still here. Suddenly, the air grew thick with tension, and the whispering began again, only this time louder, more urgent. She slammed the journal shut and backed toward the door, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move toward her, as if alive. Jenna. The door slammed shut behind her, locking with a force that nearly made her fall to the floor. Panic surged in her chest, and she turned to run. But the long hallway seemed endless, stretching farther and farther, drawing her into its depths. The shadows were closing in, No longer just whispers, but figures moving, chasing, breathing. In a house full of shadows, Jenna Ortega realized that the mansion wasn't just old, it was alive, watching her every move, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Each day she stayed, she sank further into a world where reality seemed to blur, and the walls themselves seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't understand but feared to know. She had become a part of its story, a story that no one had ever dared to finish. And as night fell again, Jenna finally understood the truth of the mansion. It would never let her leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. It had been months since Jenna Ortega had left Hollow Ridge Lane. She never spoke of the mansion to anyone, not to her friends, not to her agents, not even in passing. The house had a hold on her that words couldn't explain. But eventually, the weight of it all became too much, and with a mixture of fear and relief, she sold the property, distancing herself from the chilling memories. She told herself it was over, that moving on was the only way to preserve her sanity. But the house, it seemed, had other plans. A few weeks after Jenna's departure, the mansion on Hollow Ridge Lane found its next owners. Emily and Nate Harmon, a young couple who had just moved to Los Angeles to start fresh. Emily, an artist, and Nate, a photographer, were drawn to the house's Gothic charm and the promise of seclusion in a world that had become too loud. The locals had warned them just as they had warned Jenna, but the couple dismissed it as superstition. It was just an old house, they thought. The stories were probably exaggerated. They were wrong. The first few days were calm. The house, though large and imposing, felt strangely inviting. Emily wandered through the rooms, taking in the antique furniture, the tall windows, and the way sunlight streamed through the thick curtains. She marveled at the old portraits lining the walls, paintings of long-dead faces staring down at her, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. But by the fourth night, things began to shift. Emily was in the living room, unpacking boxes when she heard it, a faint scratching sound from upstairs. At first, she assumed it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. But the sound grew louder, more persistent, as if something or someone was clawing at the floorboards above her. She went upstairs to investigate, but found nothing. The hallway was as silent as ever, and the rooms were undisturbed. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just the old house's creaks and groans. But deep down, something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. The next evening, Nate decided to take a walk in the surrounding woods, leaving Emily alone in the house. It was during this time that the whispers began. Low, almost inaudible at first, like distant murmurs from behind the walls. Emily's pulse quickened as she listened, unable to discern the words but knowing something was there. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, making her jump. She ran to the source of the sound, the study. The door was ajar, the same door that had once remained locked, the one that Jenna had never fully explored. Emily felt her heart race as she hesitated at the threshold. And then she saw it. The journal. It was lying open on the floor, its pages fluttering as if a wind were blowing through the room, though all the windows were shut tight. The writing in the journal was frantic, almost desperate, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she read the words that had been hastily scrawled across the page. It watches from the walls. It waits. She quickly slammed the journal shut, backing away. The whispers in the walls grew louder, sharper, as if something were trying to break through. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang. She was trapped. Just then, Nate returned, his face pale, his breath ragged. "It's happening again," he gasped. Emily's heart pounded as she grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the door. "Nate, I think we need to leave. This house, it's not just old, it's wrong." But it was too late. The house seemed to come alive, the shadows twisting and flickering in the corners of the rooms. The temperature dropped, and the whispers grew into voices loud, clear, and unmistakable. Emily and Nate were no longer alone. They heard footsteps slow and deliberate coming from the hallway. And then, the unmistakable sound of breathing, heavy and labored, right behind them. Nate spun around, but there was no one there. "Emily, do you hear that?" The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Emily's blood ran cold. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a living thing. The house itself was moving, shifting, breathing, alive in a way that nothing should be. The walls groaned and creaked as if they were pressing in on them, the shadows thickening like a smothering fog. Panic set in. They ran, scrambling down the hallway, but the house seemed to twist around them, elongating the corridors, trapping them in a maze of rooms that all looked the same. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the house went silent. The footsteps stopped. The breathing ceased. But the shadows were still there. The floorboards creaked beneath them as they stood frozen in place. Something was watching them. Something that had always been there, something that had never left. They ran to the front door, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they pushed, pulled, or screamed, the door remained sealed shut, as if it were part of the house, a living entity that didn't want them to leave. And then, from the corner of her eye, Emily saw it, a shadow darting across the room, moving too quickly for her to comprehend. It was a figure, but it was no longer human. The face, if it could even be called that, was a mass of dark, contorted features, staring at them with hollow eyes. The whispers returned, now loud, insistent, as they seemed to come from every direction at once. They never left. They never will. The house had claimed its new tenants, and it would claim everyone who came after. The walls of Hollow Ridge Lane seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the heartbeat of the house growing louder with each passing minute. Emily and Nate stood at the door, hands frozen on the handle, the shadows pressing in around them like fingers curling toward prey. They could hear the whispers again, softer this time, as if the house itself was trying to speak to them, trying to warn them. But the message was unclear, disjointed, like fragments of forgotten memories. Not safe. They're waiting. Leave now. The house felt alive, not in the way one might imagine a haunted place, but like it was aware of their fear, feeding off it, twisting its own existence around them. Emily couldn't shake the sensation that the very floorboards were watching her, the ceiling above her, the air she breathed. It was all somehow aware. It was like every inch of the house was filled with the ghosts of its past, holding them in place, ensuring they would never leave. She turned to Nate, whose face had gone pale, his eyes wide and frantic. His grip on her arm tightened. "We need to find a way out," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't just some old house. It wants us here. It's trying to keep us." "I know," Emily breathed, her own voice shaking. "But we can't stay here, Nate. Something's wrong with this place. The house, it's not like other houses. It's alive." Without another word, they began searching the house frantically. The walls seemed to shift, always just out of reach. Every time they thought they had found an exit, another door or window, they found themselves back in the same hallway, standing before the same staircase. It was as if the mansion itself was playing a game with them, keeping them trapped inside its ever-changing labyrinth. And then they found something that hadn't been there before. In the farthest room of the house, hidden behind a false wall, was a narrow staircase leading downward into the bowels of the mansion. Emily and Nate exchanged uneasy glances. The air was thick and musty, the darkness so absolute that even the beam from their flashlight barely cut through it. But they had no choice. The house was closing in, and if they didn't find a way out soon, they feared they might never leave at all. They descended into the basement, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the layers of dust that coated everything. The deeper they went, the colder it became. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the weight of the air, the suffocating presence that seemed to crawl through the walls. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a large, low-ceilinged room filled with old, rotting furniture. Shelves lined the walls, and in the center of the room stood an ancient, cracked mirror. It was out of place, too modern, too polished compared to the rest of the decaying basement. Emily stepped forward, drawn to it, her hand reaching out without thinking. Just as her fingers brushed the glass, a low, grinding sound echoed through the room. The mirror shuddered, and for a split second, she thought she saw something, someone moving inside it. But when she blinked, the reflection was empty, just her own pale face staring back at her, eyes wide in shock. "Emily," Nate's voice broke through the thick air, shaky and strained. "Look at the walls." She turned, her blood running cold as her gaze fixed on the peeling wallpaper. There, etched into the surface, were words scratched hastily, as if someone had clawed them into the walls. The letters were jagged, but the message was clear. "They know you're here." A chill ran through her veins, and she felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the sensation of being watched. But not by something living, something ancient. Before she could speak, a low, rasping sound filled the air. It was the same sound they'd heard before: the breath, the footsteps, the whispering voices, but this time, it was louder, closer, and the shadows, which had been still before, seemed to shift, moving like ripples across the walls. "They are here." The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, the walls groaning as if the house was coming alive once again. A door, one they hadn't noticed before, creaked open, revealing another room at the far end of the basement. It was darker than anything they'd seen so far, and yet Emily felt herself drawn toward it, her feet moving of their own accord. "Emily, no!" Nate reached out to grab her, but she jerked away from him, her breath quickening. "I have to see," she murmured, almost in a trance. The room beyond the door was unlike anything else in the house. It was small, almost suffocating, with stone walls that seemed to pulse with a cold, damp energy. In the center of the room was a pedestal, on it, a small, cracked box. Something inside it seemed to glow faintly, as if calling to her. A low hum vibrated through the air, the source of the whispers, the cause of the pressure she had been feeling since they'd first entered the house. As Emily approached the pedestal, she felt a presence behind her, cold fingers brushing against her neck. But when she spun around, there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the suffocating darkness that seemed to press in on her from every side. Nate, now pale and shaking, was standing in the doorway. "Emily, don't touch it. Whatever that is, it's not just an old artifact. I feel it. The house wants you to open it." The air grew thick with tension, the walls seemingly closing in. Emily's hand hovered over the box, her fingers trembling. Something inside her told her to run. But another part of her, something deeper, something more primal, told her that the only way out was to understand what the house wanted from them. Her fingers brushed the lid, and that's when the house screamed, a deafening, high-pitched wail that echoed through the room, through the entire mansion, shaking the walls and rattling the floors. Emily gasped, stumbling back, but it was too late. The whispers had stopped. The breathing had ceased. And in the silence that followed, the house seemed to wait. It was ready. But were they? Emily staggered back from the pedestal, her heart hammering in her chest as the wail of the house echoed through her bones. The very foundation of Hollow Ridge Lane seemed to groan in pain, as though the walls themselves were suffocating under the weight of the secrets they had kept for so long. Nate's voice broke through the chaos, a tremble in his words. "Emily, please, we have to get out. This place it's not just a house. It's a prison." But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the box. The faint glow from within beckoned her, a force stronger than anything she had ever felt before. The house wanted her to open it. It wanted them to open it. And deep down, she realized, the house had always been waiting for someone like her. "Don't you feel it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the house's wailing. "It's alive, Nate, and it's been alive for a long time. We're part of it now. It's been calling us." Before Nate could answer, the box creaked open by itself. The soft, glowing light intensified, bathing the room in an eerie, unnatural radiance. Emily's pulse quickened as her fingers hovered over the opening, her mind screaming for her to turn away, to leave, but the pull was too strong. As she lifted the lid, an ancient, putrid stench filled the air, a suffocating, rotting odor that made her gag. But it wasn't the smell that caused her to freeze. It was what was inside. The box contained a shard, no, a fragment of something that seemed to move. A smooth, black stone-like object, with veins of deep red running through it, pulsing as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The instant her fingers brushed the stone, The house let out one final, earth-shaking scream. The room seemed to bend and twist around them. The walls stretched as if they were made of rubber, distorting reality itself. The shadows that had always lurked in the corners of the rooms now flooded toward them, swirling like dark, liquid tendrils. They reached for Emily, for Nate, and snaring them in their suffocating grasp. Nate screamed as he tried to pull Emily away, but it was too late. The shadows had already claimed them. And then, everything went silent. For a moment, Emily thought she had died. The pressure was gone. The whispers had stopped. The air felt normal. She opened her eyes, expecting to see darkness or the void. But instead, she found herself standing in the hallway of the mansion once again. But this time, something was different. The shadows weren't just in the corners of the room. They were everywhere. They clung to the walls, they seeped from the cracks in the floor. And then, as she turned toward the staircase, she saw them. Faces. Faces that had once been human, distorted and twisted by time. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their mouths twisted in silent screams. She could feel them watching, waiting, following her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even breathe. Emily, Nate's voice came from behind her, but it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, as if spoken by something else. Something that wasn't alive. She spun around, and there he was, Nate, but not Nate. His eyes were dark voids, his body bent at unnatural angles. He reached out to her, his fingers elongated and claw-like, but his face was twisted in a grotesque mockery of the man she once knew. The shadows around them surged forward, as if drawn to her presence. They enveloped Nate, pulling him into the walls, his screams silenced as the darkness consumed him whole. "No! Nate!" Emily cried, reaching for him, but the shadows were too strong. And then, she realized the house wasn't just alive. It was feasting. The house had always been waiting, always been hungry, drawing in those who entered its walls. Jenna had been right, but she hadn't known the full truth. The house didn't just trap souls, consumed them, fed on the living. As Emily stumbled backward, the floor beneath her feet gave way. She fell into the void below, into the belly of the mansion. The house seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her down into its dark depths. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the basement. She wasn't anywhere. The world had ceased to exist. The house itself had consumed everything. It had taken her. It had taken Nate. It had taken them all. But Emily wasn't alone. All around her, she heard the whispers, now clear and full of malice. "You are part of us now." And as her vision blurred, she realized that she wasn't just hearing the voices of the house anymore. She was hearing the voices of every person who had ever been trapped inside. The house had claimed them. It had claimed her. And it would never let her go. From now on, Emily's voice joined the others, echoing through the halls of Hollow Ridge Lane, whispering to anyone who might listen. But no one would. The house was waiting, and soon it would find its next victims. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.